This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Eve Engler. Today, we're going to be discussing Justin Trudeau yesterday says that Donald Trump wants to weaken Canada economically so he can annex the country, make Canada, as he puts it, the 51st state. Oddly, the man who is threatening Canada, Mr. Trump, is also saying he wants Canada to increase military spending. Simultaneously, there are a number of kind of nationalist, sort of left nationalist characters saying that they also want to have Canada increase military spending. Someone like Max Fawcett, columnist for the National Observer, stated recently it's probably time for Canada to bump its military spending to 5% of GDP. That would be about more than tripling. Double the GST to pay for it. We have to protect ourselves from this. Dean Blundell said, after today, I've never been more convinced that Canada needs to rearm, recruit, and sign strategic security deals worldwide while figuring out how to get the bomb, i.e., an atomic bomb. So you have these nationalist forces calling for increased military spending while not saying anything or very little about what the Canadian military is about, how it's structured, without calling for Canada to break from the Canadian military to break from its ties, its enabling of the U.S. Military. To discuss this, we have Tamara Lorincz, who is a well-known peace activist, is a PhD candidate at the Basili School of International Affairs. First of all, thanks for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. And what's your reaction to this kind of contradiction? Go ahead, Tamara.
Thank you very much, Eve, for having me. There is a huge contradiction. Canada is deeply integrated with the United States militarily in three important ways. One is with NORAD, the defense partnership that we have with the United States since about 1958. Canada has commanders in Colorado Springs at the NORAD base. Canada announced in August of 2022 that we are going to modernize NORAD. This is because of pressure from the United States at a cost of $38.6 billion. So we have that close defense relationship. We're also close with the United States as a member of NATO. It's the United States that dominates the 32 members of the military alliance. And it's because of pressure from the United States that Canada has been increasing our military spending to meet the NATO 2% target. In the past decade, we've increased our military spending by 100% from $20 billion to now $41 billion in order to, meet the demands of the United States. And we have now our defense minister and our prime minister saying that we're going to reach the 2% target even earlier, not 2032 anymore. They're going to try to meet it in 2027. And that's going to increase our military spending up to $81 billion annually. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. And to try to get to 5% of GDP, I mean, we're looking at $150 billion a year. And it's going to mean opportunity cost trade-offs for Canadians. And if we're spending so much on the military, it means we're spending less money on other things that Canadians need, social programs, environmental programs. And the third important way that Canada and the United States partner militarily is through U.S. Northern Command. Since 1945, Canadian soldiers and senior officers have been doing training with the U.S. military through U.S. Northern Command. And Canada is really, we can be seen as an extension of the U.S. military. We are engaged with the United States on all NATO operations. This is something that Prime Minister Trudeau said recently. Canada has been shoulder to shoulder alongside the United States in all of the NATO interventions. So this is a time for Canada to, with this new Trump administration that's so belligerent and really showing such disrespect, to rethink our defense partnership with the United States and to really think about having a more independent defense policy and foreign policy, because it's the United States that has really been dictating our defense policy for the last decades.
And yeah, in the Trudeau's defense policy statement back in 2017, they refer to interoperability uh, more than a dozen times. Interoperability with the U.S., i.e., that we need to have a military equipment that can work seamlessly with the U.S. So we need to buy weapon systems that are the same weapon systems the U.S. uses, so the Canadian military can work alongside, can bomb Libya in 2011 alongside the U.S., or bomb Serbia in 1999 alongside the U.S., or go to war in Afghanistan alongside the U.S., or if you go back even further historically, participate in the Korean War in the early 1950s. Because the U.S. Wanted Canada to. So clearly, since World War II, Canadian military policy is totally integrated with the U.S. military, and the Canadian military basically is an extension of the U.S. Empire. Now, one of these elements in this whole kind of interoperability type thinking, one of these elements that's kind of maybe the highest profile one recently is the Canada purchasing the F-35 from Lockheed Martin, a U.S. giant, the biggest arms company in the world. And Canada's spending about $20 billion up front on these F-35s, paying the U.S. Arms firm about $20 billion. Now, I recently asked NDP leader Jagmeet Singh if, in the context of the dispute with Trump, he would call for Canada reconsidering purchasing the F-35 and paying all this money to the U.S. giant. I saw recently that the Green Party has put out a statement where they did explicitly say that Canada should reconsider purchasing the F-35, and the Globe and Mail seems to have recently published an op-ed by Michael Byers putting forward that idea of reconsidering purchasing the F-35. What's your kind of reaction to the F-35? Whether Canada should not purchase the F-35 in this context of dispute with Trump?
Well, I've always been opposed to Canada buying a new fleet of fighter jets, F-35s, the Saab Gripen, the Boeing Super Hornet, right from the beginning. Canada announced in January of 2023 that we were going to buy a new fleet of F-35s, 88, for a price tag of $19 billion. The life cycle cost is going to be $70 billion. We know that from an estimate that the parliamentary budget officer did. And these stealth fighters, they're designed for first strike attacks, decapitation strikes. They're not defensive fighter designed as defensive fighter jets. And they're not built in Canada. They're built in the United States. They're extremely expensive to operate and to maintain. And there's a real concern that we're going to be spending more than $70 billion, to operate these fighter jets over their lifetime. We shouldn't be buying them. This is not a priority for Canada. It's the F-35 purchase. It's the second most expensive federal procurement in Canadian history, and it really doesn't serve the threat assessment that Canada is facing. if Canadians had a real opportunity to identify the threats that we're faced with, poverty and climate change, we wouldn't be investing in fighter jets. We would be investing in things like housing and healthcare and education, in those kinds of things. It's because of this trade relationship and defense relationship that we have the United States that we're making the bad procurement. The F-35 is a bad fighter jet. It has over 800 deficiencies. We're just buying these fighter jets to appease the Americans, and now they've got a president who's very aggressive, wanting to change the rules on close allies like Canada. And so this is a good time for us to rethink this purchase of buying the F-35. And I think that this would be a really great signal to say, we're not going to buy these fighter jets. We never should have bought them in the first place. And instead we're going to maybe work with China on high-speed rail or something like that. We need to think about developing closer relationships with other countries, diversifying our trade, and building things like human security, common security with other countries. And yeah.
And I found it remarkable that Jagmeet Singh wasn't willing to say that he would reconsider purchasing the F-35 amidst this dispute. Like I didn't expect him to actually say, we will cancel the F-35 procurement. But I thought that, to put that on the table amidst negotiation with Trump, I mean, how could anyone not be willing to put that on? Instead of talking about annexing Canada, talking about destroying the Canadian economy, and you can't put that on the table. So that to me was fairly remarkable, and I think indicative of the fact that the power of the U.S. Military industrial complex in Canada, obviously working alongside the Canadian military. Now, the Department of National Defense says, quote, says there are, quote, 80 treaty level agreements, more than 250 memorandum of understanding, and 145 bilateral forums on defense between Canada and the U.S. Okay, now in this context of annexation threats, it seems reasonable to say that the Canadian military should Canadian government should talk about ending some of these bilateral agreements, or arrangements, accords. Obviously, the most well-known one, NORAD, you referred to it. NORAD actually allows U.S. Commander to deploy fighter jets in Canada without an express approval of Canadian officials. So that's an obvious impingement on sovereignty, and NORAD brings Canada into the U.S. Military machine all around the world. Any war the U.S. is involved in, Canada becomes part of it via NORAD, among other areas. Now, one of the things that I think that would be eminently reasonable to the vast majority of Canadians to put on the table amidst this competition, or this conflict with the U.S. and Trump, is that Canada would pause, let's call it, officer training in the U.S. until that time that the U.S. Until Trump stops with the annexation comments. Okay, another thing that I think most Canadians would consider quite reasonable amidst Trump's threats is to say that there would be no more joint naval missions between the Canadian Navy and the U.S. Navy in Asia, Mediterranean, or other far distances from Canadian shores. What's your kind of thoughts on proposals like that, which I haven't seen anyone anywhere mention? Simple lessening of Canada's military ties with the U.S., so long as the president of the U.S. is saying that we might, we want economic sabotage to force you to become the 51st state. What's your thoughts on sort of that thinking?
Well, I certainly think that Canada should have the courage to make decisions like you've just identified, to say things like, we're not going to sail our warships alongside you off the coast of China in our Indo-Pacific strategy that we announced in the fall of 2022. It mentioned in that strategy that we were going to militarize the Indo-Pacific region and operate alongside the United States and the UK. And we've been seeing Canadian warships doing just that. They're regularly sailing out of Esquimalt, out of Halifax as well. Doing these very provocative naval operations with the United States. So this is definitely something that we should say we're going to stop doing. The other thing is last year was the 75th anniversary of NATO. Canada sent, a delegation to Washington, D.C. to mark this 75th anniversary. And we announced that we were going to engage with the United States and Norway, some of the other NATO Arctic allies, in a new ice pact, doing more operations in the Arctic. And this is something else that we can end. So there's lots of things that we should be doing, especially on the military front, to extricate ourselves from the United States. Because if we're serious about sovereignty and if we're serious about our own defense, when we have a neighbor like the United States that's more aggressive, more disrespectful, then we need to think about having greater sovereignty over our defense forces, and then also converting that into something more peaceful and collaborative and cooperative with other countries. Canada has been too close and insular with the 32 NATO allies, and we haven't been working well with the other 162 countries that are outside of NATO. And this is the time that we maybe need to move away from the United States shadow and dominance, and work more collaboratively with countries like Mexico, who also border the United States, but has an independent foreign policy. And President of Mexico, Sheinbaum, has made an announcement that she would like to try to counter what the United States is doing under Trump, and working more closely with Canada, which is a really great thing. And we need to take more clues or more inspiration from Mexico. They have an independent foreign policy that centers on disarmament, peace, and cooperation. It's beautiful. People should check it out. So let's get closer to Mexico and other countries at this time.
And if you look at it, Mexico spends about half as much of its GDP on the military and about half as much in real dollars as Canada. And they've been trading, even, this goes before Trump, they've been trading with the US, actually even more than Canada has as a proportion of GDP. So obviously that can be happened. Now, I think, just to conclude, I think if you want to anger Donald Trump, if you want, defund Canada's military. I mean, I think if you want to make sure that Donald Trump is angry, that if you want to react, you want to be in a bargaining, you say, if you keep these tariffs, we're going to every month that you keep the tariffs, we are going to cut. Let's go with $1 billion from Canada's military spending, or 500 million from Canada's military spending. You will find, if you want to keep the tariffs, if you want to do all this pressure, we are going to end training missions with Canadian military. We're going to end the naval missions. We're going to end, deploying alongside the U.S. If you look, actually, Canada's military in the Middle East, a whole much of this deployment, of course, is designed to support the U.S. Final thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love for Canada to cancel all of these weapons purchase. Last year, we also announced that we're going to buy a new fleet of strategic refuelers for the F-35s. This is made by Boeing, the American corporation. We are also building a new fleet of warships, and the navigation systems and the weapon systems are by Lockheed Martin. So there's a lot of ways that we can cut the flow of Canadian funds to the United States from these defense purchases and put the squeeze on the Americans. But this is also, as I said, a really important time for us to, as Canadians, to think about how the United States has militarized our defense policy, our budgets by increasing military spending. This is a really good time for us to take charge of our defense policy, our foreign policy, have more independence, and have it centered on peace and disarmament and cooperation. And this is a great time to cancel the weapons purchases, stop all of this interoperability with the United States, and let's say no to NATO. Let's get out of the U.S. nuclear armed umbrella and work cooperatively with other countries.
Stand up to Donald Trump, defund the Canadian military could be a slogan, or maybe kick Donald Trump in the teeth, defund the Canadian military. Thanks a lot for coming on, talking foreign policy, Tamara.